Okay, at this time of year, we also do like a little bit of a recap about photography and using cameras in general. So I'll go through that with you now as well. Okay, so on the photography blog, if we go to resources, follow the link like we usually do. And in our usual folder, Oreo and evaluation sheets, all the documents there that we normally use. So photographers, Oreo analysis sheets, example work, but in it is something called quick guide planning that you can see here. And normally we'd go through it in class and we'd make our own little booklet. So there's a photo planning guide here with a pink triangle on it. So if you're lucky and you've got a printer at home, you could print this out and you could fill it in following this PowerPoint. So in the quick guide planning, when it opens up, it basically recaps the basics of photography. So we're looking at something called the exposure triangle. So what we would do to get like the ideal exposure, the ideal version of our picture, is we consider three different things. So aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So these three factors work together to give you your ideal exposure. So they're the kind of things you have control over within the camera. So just so you know what they are, and that you can annotate if you're working along in your booklet, or you could make a note in the back of your sketchbook, we'll go through them one by one. So aperture is basically the hole within the lens through which light travels into the camera body. So a good way to think about it is it's just like your eye. So if it's actually very dark outside, your iris opens up much more to let more light in so that you can still see even in dark conditions. And similarly, when it gets really bright, it actually contracts and becomes smaller, so it's not letting too much light into your eye and it's not hurting your eye. So the camera is exactly the same. So it can add dimension to your photographs by altering depth of field, something that you'd want to have control over. And it also alters the exposure of your images by making them brighter or darker. So it's also called an f-stop, and the lower the number, the larger the opening in the lens. So you can see here an f1.4 has a really wide opening. So really wide opening, really low number. And an f16 is a really high number, it's a large number, but a very small opening in the lens there. So aperture also affects light, because you know from your research and doing your timeline that it's the way that the light passes into the camera and gets recorded that gives you your image. So a large aperture or a wide opening will let a lot of light through. So you can see here a large aperture lets a lot of light, so you get a very bright photograph. And similarly, the opposite is true of a small aperture. So like your eye, letting less light in. So in terms of thinking about aperture, that will also take into account shutter speed as well. So if you're using a low f-stop, so you've got a large hole letting a lot of light in, you'll need a faster shutter speed. You don't want the actual shutter to be open for too long because it'll let too much light in and bleach out the photo. Similarly so, if you're using a high f-stop, so the small aperture there, the shutter will need to stay open longer. So that means a longer or a slower shutter speed will be needed because it's got to get time to let that light come through a smaller opening. So aperture and shutter speed work together in that way. Something you guys will already know about is depth of field, and aperture controls that as well. So some images have a shallow or thin depth of field because that's a shallow or thin amount of the distance between the camera and the subject matter is in focus. And then that would mean that the background is rendered out of focus. So other images have a large depth of field, so that distance between the camera and the subject matter and beyond is in focus and is sharp. So large aperture means it's a shallower depth of field, so it blurs the background. Small aperture means that everything is crisp and everything is in focus. So the lower the f-stop, the less depth of field, the blurrier the background. The higher the f-stop, the greater the depth of field, the sharper the background. So that's illustrated in that image there. So a large aperture results in a large amount of background blur, so it's desirable for things like portraits, like what portrait mode on your mobile phone looks like. This example here is really nice with the blurred background and this bokeh effect in the foreground. So for classic portraiture, we separate our subject from the surroundings by using selective focus and choosing a large aperture, like a lower f-stop, like f2.8, creates a very shallow depth of field with only this subject here in focus. So not the foreground or the background, the subject. And it helps direct the viewer's attention right into the subject, right into those eyes there. The opposite is also true, so for apertures like f8, f11 or f16 you want sharp details in the foreground and the background. This is really good for landscapes. You want to be able to see that distance and get that sense of like grand scale. So a small aperture results in a small amount of background blur, which is typically ideal for things like landscape and architecture. And in the landscape photo here, small apertures used to make sure that both the foreground and the background are as sharp as possible, front to back. So shutter speed you guys have already explored a little bit of, and it's responsible basically for two things: changing the brightness of your photo or doing something like freezing action or blurring motion. So you guys know from your long exposures with the light trails, we're blurring that motion and keeping that as part of the initial image that we get through the camera. So shutter speed is the length of time that the camera shutter is open. So a bit like we talked about its relationship with aperture, exposing light onto the camera sensor. So in terms of if your shutter speed is long, moving subjects in your photos will appear blurred along the direction of motion. A bit like if someone was shaking their head or if they were walking, that actual motion would be blurred. And on the other hand, if your shutter speed's really fast, you can freeze motion, resulting in like sharp images that capture a moment in time. A bit like we looked at before in terms of thinking about aperture, shutter speed also affects brightness of your image. So slow shutter speed means the camera sensor gathers a lot of light and the photo will be quite bright, like this side here. But also at fast shutter speed, the camera sensor is only exposed to a small fraction of light, resulting in a darker photo. So looked at aperture, looked at shutter speed, what's left is ISO. So ISO is basically your light sensitivity. So the setting that brightens or darkens your photo. The higher the number, the brighter the photo appears, but raising your ISO has consequences. So a photo taken at too high in ISO will show a lot of grain, so you'll get that sort of noise in your photo. So you should always approach it by thinking about like your lowest ISO setting that you can take a photo with, because you want to preserve quality there. So like your base ISO, as it says here. So it's an important setting because it gives you the potential to produce the highest image quality and minimize grain. So you always want to try and stick to your base ISO, especially when you're working in low light conditions as well. Try that first and then you can bump it up. So here you can see like an evidence of that grain there. So there's a lot of grain between the two. So sometimes you will actually need to affect it. So when to use low ISO is always really. So sticking to ISO 100 or 200 whenever you can. So whenever there's plenty of light, try and minimize that because you don't want to use grain. So when to increase ISO is when you're freezing motion. So when fighting against motion blur. So you don't want like a blurry photo. So here, the ISO has been bumped up to 800 instead of the regular 100 or 200 because they want to capture that bird in motion. So if the ISO was 100, they would have needed a different shutter speed to capture a bright photo. And at that sort of shutter speed, there would have been a lot of unwanted motion blur on the bird. So changing the shutter speed wouldn't capture the bird as they wanted, so it wouldn't freeze that motion. So instead they had to make a choice to change the ISO instead. ISO is sometimes also like weather dependent, because obviously you're thinking of how bright the light is. But like we've talked about before, you always want to try and stick to that base thing. Or you could try and affect your shutter speed as well to see if you could tweak it with that. But yeah, you want to try and stick with that base ISO. So basically, to maximise quality and minimise grain, select the aperture setting that will provide your desired depth of field, like we've talked about before, the kind of picture you want to get. Set the ISO to its base value, so 100, and put your shutter speed to whatever setting provides a good exposure. So you might try a couple of different speeds there till you get the right one. If your subject's blurry, a bit like we talked about with the bird, you want to catch it in motion, you want to then just nudge it up a little bit at a time until you get rid of that motion blur. So that's your best way of working. And if your ISO is getting too high and you still have the ability to use a wider aperture, open it up until the ISO gets to a more manageable level, even if it means sacrificing a little bit of your desired depth of field. So that's looking at what's called your exposure triangle and the kind of things that you need to consider. These could be really good to add as notes, or you could look for little quick guides on Pinterest and you could pin them to a board, and you can always bump back to those if you're doing a shoot to see if you could come up with some ideas that might help you get the best kind of exposure and the best kind of image for the shot you're trying to take. So always come back to review those things, tweak those things, and also you're getting to know your way around your own camera and know the kind of image that you're going to get as well.